Yeah, there's a mic each. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to our policy session. I really appreciate you all being here. And thank you for taking your seats, being on time. It's been a really inspiring day already. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you had a great lunch as well and were able to participate in Robert Rizzi's piece, especially. That was very exciting. This afternoon, we're going to have another great discussion. But we are going to kick it off with an overview of this morning's discussion for anyone who missed it, and also just to distill it. So before we go any further, I would love to welcome Lucas to the stage, where he will present. Have you sent the slides? Perfect. Well, he will present this morning's findings. Thank you so much for doing this in such time. I will hand over the microphone. You're welcome.
Okay, yeah, welcome from me as well, and good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. So, to this policy panel discussion, which we're going to be going into in a bit, which is looking at the kind of relationships between sustainability, well-being, and culture and art. And I should probably introduce myself as well. I'm Lucas. I work for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in Scotland, also short for We All Scotland. And I had the pleasure with my colleague this morning and Karen from Creative Scotland to facilitate a roundtable discussion on kind of how we bring issues of sustainability and equality into the arts and how they are related. And it was a very, very rich discussion, and I really enjoyed it. So what I will try to do in the next 20 minutes or so is give you a little bit of an overview of the concept of a well-being economy, which we kind of used this morning as a lens to look at issues around sustainability and equality. And to kind of bring us a bit on the same page, I will go over kind of what that concept is about. Apologies to those who were here this morning and you've heard this before. But then I will also spend a bit of time to try and summarize and pull out some of the key themes that came out of the discussion. And I will try to do it justice, but it was an incredibly rich discussion, so hopefully I will get some of the main points across, but please don't be disappointed if not everything is there. Right, so I don't know whether we have the slides or... Okay, so slides will be there in a minute, but basically, so as I said, I work for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland, and the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is a collaboration of individuals and organizations working together to build a well-being economy, which we consider to be an economy designed to deliver social justice on a healthy planet. And I work for the Scotland Hub, which is quite active, but it's very much a global movement, and there's a global We All AMP team as well. There's also hubs kind of popping up all over the world and being developed at the moment. Most relevant for this audience is that there is now an established hub in Denmark and in Sweden and in Ireland as well. And there's discussions around hubs being established in Norway and Iceland. And perfect. Can we have the next slide, please? And really what brings that kind of movement together is kind of the shared understanding that it's really the way we have designed our economy that is kind of driving a lot of the social and environmental challenges we are facing. And that's, I don't have to tell you much about that. Next slide, please. Because you just need to switch on the news and you will all well aware of the challenges we are facing in terms of climate change and biodiversity loss, as well as poverty and inequality. And again, the idea behind the wellbeing economy and the motivation is that we can address these issues together if we look at the way we design our economy and move beyond kind of the way we set it up at the moment, which is very much focused at GDP growth at all costs. It's focused on financial returns in the short term rather than necessarily wider social impacts. And also in the way that our economy, I would say, very much undervalues a lot of the things that are actually really important for our well-being, whether that is care work, but also arts and culture. And in a sense, that means then what the well-being economy is saying is, okay, the good news is that we can change that. Like, the economy is not governed by natural laws. It's human laws and institutions that make it up, and we can change these to design it to prioritize social justice on a healthy planet, which in a nutshell is what a well-being economy is about. Next slide, please. So the question then is, what is a well-being economy, now that I've been going on about it for quite a while? And you will be potentially disappointed to hear that it's not a blueprint, it's not a specific list of policies, it's not a roadmap that you can follow step by step either. But what it really is a different way of thinking about the economy. It's a different way of asking questions, what the economy is for, who it is for, and it's about imagining what a different economy could look like. And that will look very different in different contexts, in different sectors, in different countries, and not one organization has all the answers on how to do that, and we certainly don't. But we do have some principles that we find very helpful to start thinking about what a well-being economy is. And these were very much, we call them the 5 well-being needs, and we developed these with members across the world. And the first one of those is dignity, so the idea that everyone has enough to live in safety, comfort, and happiness, whether that is through generous social safety nets, something like a basic income, good public services. The second one is nature, so a restored and safe natural world for all life, operating well within planetary boundaries. The third one is fairness, so it's the idea that power, wealth, and income is distributed fairly, and also that we actually design that into the economy using more democratic business models, community wealth building strategies. The next one is purpose, so it's the idea that our institutions serve the common good, that the kind of things that are good for people and planet are also rewarded properly. And in practice, I said some of the goals we use for economic policy, like GDP, but also looking at how we run our businesses. And then the last and probably the most important one is participation. So it's the idea that we can't really design a well-being economy from the top down, but it's something that we need to build on meaningful participation of the people who are actually going to be involved in that economy. And whether that is in their workplaces, in their communities, in their political landscape. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what a well-being economy is like. And the big question is now, so how does that relate to music and arts and culture, which is the big question that we tried to tackle this morning in the discussion. So we asked the kind of question kind of in both ways. So one is, what would an economy look like that supported an arts and culture sector to thrive in a way that is sustainable and just? but also the other way around, how can we embed the principles of a well-being economy and sustainability into the way we do arts and culture. And I will now attempt to kind of summarize a little bit of the fascinating discussion that followed. And I've kind of, for this purpose, pulled out about 4 themes. And so the first one, which I think is really at the base of it, is that idea is like, what actually is art and culture? And there were some really strong points that music, arts and culture is sometimes seen as like an optional extra. It's like, once we've dealt with poverty and that kind of stuff, then we can start thinking about arts and culture. And there was a very strong sense that that's not the case, that really arts and culture is a fundamental need, and we can have as much food and clothing and what we want. If we don't have, without arts and culture, what will be the point? And that it's very much then, it's related to every single aspect of our lives and about the things that we cherish about our societies, whether that's our democracy, our communities, connections to other people, but also our connections to other species and to the natural world. Okay, next slide, please. The second bit is then kind of a bit more of the discussion was about, okay, what is the relationship of that to the economy? If we start from that point of cultures like and arts and music as this important bedrock. And there we had quite a bit of a discussion about whether we should justify art in economic terms and numbers. Like there's studies in some countries or where you see, okay, every investment of £1 in that sector would lead to £3 in kind of social returns. I think we had an example, I can't remember from what country. And that kind of, translates some of the impacts of arts and culture into a language that more policymakers, especially economically minded policymakers, understand. But that also comes with risks. So there was a bit of a split opinion, I think, on this, because there's also a lot of arts and culture and what it brings that cannot be captured in these numbers, and so you risk of missing out, and you really might miss out on really showing the unique contributions that arts and culture makes, which you can't get from anywhere else. We can talk about the economy and we can talk about arts and culture in very abstract terms, but it's, in the end of the day, it's people who are doing it, and we need to think about these people. And in many ways, it's probably a very, very large part of the population has engaged in arts and cultural activities, even if they might not do it as a job or they're not paid to do it. And what came very strong through for me was really how big of an experience the COVID pandemic has been, and what of an incision point it was for, and I should say I'm not from kind of the arts and culture sector, and this has been the first space where that has come through that strongly. Like in other spaces I've given this presentation, that has not come up, so it's very interesting to see that, and so we need to really acknowledge and work with that kind of the repercussions that we're still seeing from that. And there was some very strong points about that, whatever we do in the arts and culture sector, we have to involve the people who actually do it in these decisions. And in that sense, and that very strongly relates to the kind of participation element of the well-being economy as well. And there were very good points about celebrating diversity, making sure art is accessible for people, especially I think neurodiversity was mentioned, but also other aspects of diversity. And it's really the point, I think Angela made that, was like, if we have a society where our artists are going hungry, what are we doing? Like, what's the point? And then finally, getting to the last slide, and that was really another big theme that came out as well, maybe unsurprisingly, around fairness and funding. And that is, in terms of the funding side, it's both about how much funding there is and valuing how important arts and culture is. But it's also a lot came up around how that funding is delivered, like in the sense that it's very competitive at the moment often. It means you have to spend a lot of time writing funding applications that you might never get. and that, you know, it comes with a lot of strings attached, so that there was definitely a call to make it more long-term, more collaborative, and give artists more freedom to just develop their art rather than trying to put them into boxes and make them tick boxes. And there was a point about really the big gap about how artists talked about, like, you know, especially politicians, no offense, love to talk about, say, how great the art is in this country, you know, and you use it to how to sell the country, but then that is not matched by the amount of money that the government's actually put into funding it, if you look at the kind of pay levels in the sector. And so there were questions around power, like who decides on the funding, who stands up for artists and cultural workers. There were proposals on the online kind of feedback on whether we should more think about arts and culture as a government service. And the example was there of the kind of basic income for the arts in Ireland as a kind of different way of thinking about it, maybe. And I will stop there. I hope I've roughly given the discussion justice, and that maybe gives us some food for thought for the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Lucas.
That's good. Thank you. Pressure's really a pleasure to be here and recognize the presence of my friend, Cabinet Secretary Angus. Good to see you again. Dear all, and also thanks to you, Lucas, for your introduction and presentation of the ideas from the roundtable discussion. This useful. So I will speak on behalf of the embassies of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the representation of Faroe Island, and the Finnish Institute in London. And I would like to express my sincere thanks to all those who have been involved in organizing Nordic's Music Exchange Program as part of the Nordic Music Days in Glasgow this week. We know that such high-profile international festivals are invaluable meeting places where personal relationships are made and strengthened, and new projects and collaborations are created. It gives opportunities to network, learn, and get inspired with colleagues from the Nordics, Scotland, and beyond. The Nordic countries and Scotland have close cultural bonds. We are small and have open economies and have a shared commitment to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. While both the Scottish welfare system and the Nordic welfare model share similarities, like in universal access to essential services, focus on social and public funding, there are also differences among us, also between the Nordic countries. For the Norwegian government's cultural and equality policies, the fundamental goal is to ensure that everyone has the freedom and opportunity to live a good and secure life as they wish. Therefore, it is essential to break down barriers and reduce inequalities so that everyone across the country can participate freely and equally in various social arenas, in communities and activities. Access to arts and culture, sport, volunteerism, free media, and public debate is important for each and all of us. It is also crucial for the society and democracy itself that everyone, regardless of who we are or where we live in the country, can participate and contribute. Some of the main priorities in the year to come. The first is culture throughout the country. We want a vibrant, inclusive, and diverse cultural life. A cultural life that everyone can participate in and experience throughout Norway, not only in Oslo. Secondly, culture for everyone. We want an inclusive society There is a special focus on children and young people. It is important that they can participate in cultural activities, sports, and outdoor activities that are affordable. Another priority is policy for artists and cultural workers. We want to facilitate working opportunities for artists in Norway and abroad, and to ensure fair remuneration and good working conditions for artists. Culture, sports, and volunteerism play a key role in the change of attitude needed to meet the goals we have committed to in Paris Agreement. The UN Sustainable Development Goals apply to all countries and all parts of society. The work to achieve these goals is central to the Norwegian government. Culture is subject to the same changes that the rest of society must undergo in the transition to a low-emission society. Achieving the societal change we are committed to requires a range of changes, both on the individual and community levels. Culture, sports, and volunteerism hold a unique position in each of our lives. Therefore, these can be arenas for attitude change and places to test new sustainable solutions, or being community spaces for engagement and participation in the green shift. Many stakeholders already possess significant expertise, but it is essential to create favorable conditions and opportunities for more actors to make the sustainable choices needed. Now I really look forward to following the panel discussion on these and other topics, so thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. So yes, now the main event. I am very excited to ask my wonderful panel up to the stage, including the Cabinet Secretary Robinson. We really appreciate you being here and participating in this conversation. So yes, if my wonderful panel could come up to the stage, that'd be great. Sina, any seat as long as Sina is back here. Yeah. This is your microphone. I will take this with me.
Why is it so quiet?
We're excited. Thank you very much, Jess. While the panelists finding their seats, I can introduce myself. My name is Signe Tofte Hannibal. I'm the General Manager of the Danish Composers Society and also facilitating the Nordic Composers Council, partnering with Scotland on Nordic Music Days 2024 in Glasgow. And it's a pleasure for me to be the moderator of this afternoon's panel. And I'll begin introducing the four panelists. We have Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson, Lucas Bunce, Policy and Engagement Lead at Wellbeing Alliance Scotland, Gunn Hernes, Director of the Nordic House in the Faroe Islands, and Gary McCartney, Professor of Wellbeing Economy at the Glasgow University. So, warm welcome to you all. And Gary, now we listen to the learnings and the discussions from this morning's session. And I'd like to start with you by asking you a question in relation to the paper that you published last year, Achieving a Wellbeing Economy, where you highlighted how culture is often misunderstood as secondary to basic needs, when in fact, as we also saw on the post-it notes, it is a vital component of societal well-being. So how do you think that policymakers can reframe culture as an essential asset, especially in the context of sustainability and well-being economies?
Oh, thank you for that big, huge question. Yeah. I'll try and be as succinct as possible. And thank you for the invitation to speak. So you're right. I think in the paper we were arguing that culture is too often seen at the top of the sort of Maslow hierarchy. So, you know, we have to focus on food and shelter first, and then eventually, on the never, never, tomorrow never comes, we can then afford culture. And the risk of that, I think, is very evident in the world today. So democracy is under challenge. We don't necessarily have a shared narrative about the problems we face, the challenges that are so prevalent in the world, whether they be war or famine or climate change or biodiversity loss. And we need to reimagine a future. And culture, whether it's media, whether it's music, whether it's film, whether it's theatre, whether it's people picking up guitars down their local community centre and having that shared endeavour, that shared culture, that's the spaces in which we can reimagine how we act as a society and collectively and change so that we address those crises that we face. But more than that, in the paper, as you say, a well-being economy is nothing if it's not cultural flourishing, because frankly, where would we all rather be now and tonight? We want to be engaging in those cultural activities that float our boat, whether it's playing music, listening to music, watching films, playing Scrabble, whatever your cultural outlet is, that's really what we want to spend our time and enjoy, and that's what makes life worth living. So it needs to be both an objective for a well-being economy. The economy needs to be able to support cultural flourishing in all its different forms, whatever that might be for each and one of us. But it also needs to be a means of achieving that, a way of creating that share.
And you argue that neoliberal economics has commodified culture, diminishing its social value. And how do you think that Scotland and the Nordic countries can shift away from treating culture as merely an economic engine and instead foster its role as a precondition for societal well-being and resilience?
Yeah, so for those of you that were here this morning, I related a bit of a story from a colleague of mine, Justin O'Connor, who's a professor at the University of Adelaide in Australia. So Justin was around the Manchester music scene. And the Manchester music scene was seen as one of those creative industries. So culture was defined and redefined as an industry and valued for its ability to create jobs and to add to. And as a result of that education, that enumerating what culture and arts and music could add, that justified, if you like, investment by governments in it. But what that's led to, frankly, is quite a thin evaluation of what culture might be. So yes, Taylor Swift might come and play in the Hydro and the Glasgow hotels might be full, but it's not a very participatory form of culture. We don't all get to sing those songs, we're not all on stage. And so Justin and others argue that by commodifying it, by counting culture merely in that way, we diminish the real value of culture, and we need to think of different ways of doing it. And I think we've looked at the wellbeing economy and the foundational economy and different ways of conceptualizing what the economy is for. And it speaks to some of the notes that Lucas showed earlier on, that if we reimagine culture as being one of those foundations on which good societies are built, it can help us address those problems for the future, it can help us create those shared narratives, and it can also make life that much more fun.
Thank you. Gunn, you talked about the Green Roadmap this morning, and I wanted to ask you about, in developing the Green Roadmap, how did you approach the integration of local cultural values and traditions with wider sustainability goals?
Yeah, maybe I could just start by saying just a little bit about the roadmap, so we just include everybody. But we and Nordic House in the Faroe Islands is a part of the Nordic Council of Ministers, having this vision 2030 of being the most sustainable and integrated region by 2030. And it's only 5 years left, and we all are on board, and this is a kind of a practical tool on how to get there. So then working locally for us, also being based in Faroe, is the most natural way of working. So to integrate it into the Green Roadmap, this is a kind of toolbox, a roadmap, a map where to go to work with sustainability, looking from a cultural institution perspective. Is no other way to do that, and then to we kind of didn't make it so specific. We worked on a kind of on the level that the whole region can be included, meaning islands. Not talking about not flying, because that's not
And can you give one example of how you have followed the green roadmap or implemented it into either your programming or operations in the Nordic House?
Sorry, you should let me know. Did you hear? No, I do it one more time. No, I will not. Sorry for those on the stream. You didn't get it, but hopefully we meet sometime and I can explain. A good example is also we work with politics. So we have the possibility to use the roadmap, which is made of professions on different areas in the Nordics, to push them, to pull them in the right direction. And it's not my opinion that we should have green energy. We need green energy for the culture house. So that's the more kind of concrete and quite practical thing that we've been doing, working political to make change in the structure of the house. But then also working with artists coming and also working on a longer period of time, doing workshops, getting contact in other venues and touring locally. So kind of on a very kind of big making the green energy change, but also on a very practical level that when people visit and also change into where our cafe is vegetarian. It's not very common in the Faroe Islands, so kind of make that also as a political statement and as a discussion. Is it the most sustainable way to live in the Faroe Islands?
Interesting. And Angus, jumping over to you. The Scottish Government is committed to bringing forward a community wealth building bill in 2024-2025. And how does this kind of approach to local economic development intersect with the creative placemaking approach to help support the sustainable development of the culture sector in communities, both rural and urban communities?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and listen to and learn from your earlier conversations and also reflect, given the job that I do, so for the benefit of friends in the audience who are visiting Scotland, I'm the Scottish Government Minister who's responsible for culture, cultural policy and so on, and I always have been massively interested in best practice from elsewhere. And that's why I think events like this are tremendously important to bring us all together. We don't have a monopoly on common sense. There will be some areas where the Faroes is miles ahead of Norway, and there will be areas where Scotland is doing things in terms of our cultural policy and approach to things might be further ahead. And I would just love us to meet more often. As part of this journey. I will come to your question. Sorry, I'm not giving a politician's answer, but also for the benefit of people who are in the audience who are visiting Scotland. I think you're here at a very interesting time in terms of cultural policy for a number of reasons. One of the slides was talking about the reality that we've all faced of how have we got through COVID, how has the culture and arts sector got through COVID, the impact that it's had on people, on institutions, and on the cultural life of the country, because there's been massive change, and you'll recognize all of that, of course. We have had some additional challenges. If there are people here from the Scottish cultural and arts community, they would be the first to tell you, and would be right to say that we've been going through a very distressed financial period in relation to the cultural and arts sector. And at the same time, we've also had a very informed public debate about the way in which culture is viewed societally, governmentally, financially, needs to change. And it's a long introduction to me in trying to explain that on a number of different levels, we are actually being hugely ambitious about turning a tanker, given all the challenges that we have. So we have made a commitment as a government to raise cultural spending by an additional and annual amount of £100 million a year, which, given where we currently are, is a very significant increase on things. So that increase is beginning to happen. We are about to introduce multi-annual year funding to cultural and arts organisations. So we'll be the first part of the UK to do that. So if you're somebody working in the cultural sector, rather than having to put in an annual bid, you were making the mention of all of the paperwork and you might not even be successful. We're trying to move to a system in Scotland where funding bids would allow you to get on with your practice and not have to do as things currently. That's a massive change, and it's coming, fingers crossed, after our budgetary process. But then you get into and this is where I will question, we're also making some pretty big strides about what role do we think culture plays? And it's not just about making a pound, shilling and pence assessment of, oh, look at the screen sector in Scotland, it's amazing. It's now, whatever, £630 million GVA annual, and it's really going gangbusters in Scotland, and it will be north of £1 billion by 2030, i.e. making a financial calculation that this is a really valuable and growing important part of our cultural sector. It is going in the right direction, that's great. But do we really want to apply the same metric to everything else in culture? To which the answer is, I can say to a fellow German speaker, is jein. It is ja und nein at the same time. Because we do need to prove a significant benefit that culture brings, but that shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of supporting culture and its intrinsic value. Because the minute I've said to my colleagues in government, do you appreciate that for this much money that we put into supporting screen, we're getting that much return, people's eyes light up when they realize that there is an economic component to the cultural contribution which is worthy of support, and that makes it easier when I'm trying to persuade my colleagues in government to increase spending. That's part one of what is definitely changing big style at the moment. Second thing is, a couple of years ago I proposed to the Scottish Government Cabinet that we should mainstream culture across government. So culture shouldn't just be viewed as being that thing over there, the nice to have. It was reflected in quite a lot of the post-its in the presentation. Something that happens over there, oh, you do that, don't you? You're the culture guy in government and, they do all of that. The role already and should play and must play, and we're talking about well-being in significant part, that you might have in the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, and should make us all realize that culture matters right across government, and there's been agreement about that. And that's a work in progress. And part of that work in progress, long introduction to your question, is that where we can use means like legislation to be able to deliver as part of this wellbeing approach, because the Scottish Government is signed up as a partner to the wellbeing constellation of countries that want to drive this approach. And that is one of the areas that we are looking at doing it on a community level. Now, without wanting to monopolize the microphone for too much longer, I do want to put on the record that, it's not governments that do culture. It's not. It is the creative sector that does culture, and it's communities that wish to have culture at the heart of what they're doing. So what does government do? Well, government needs to understand, listen to the encouragement of heading in this right direction. We need to mainstream it across government to realize that this isn't just this nice to have bolt-on thing in terms of culture. And where we can legislate, because it is the most effective way of doing it, we should do it. But the funding of culture in this country, as it is in all Nordic and Northern European countries, is done through arm's length cultural organizations. Because it's not for the culture minister to say, oh, I love the RSNO. Thumbs up at the back. But the idea that because I like the RSNO, it should get all of the money in the culture budget is for the birds. It's not the way it works. We have arm's length decision making, and although the fact that the RSNO is here and they are a national performing company which we fund directly, we work very hard to make sure that we support culture across the board through very objective criteria, and long may that continue. So I'm just trying to make the point that where government sees a role to make sure that we have to deliver, And the point was made by the ambassador about culture beyond Oslo. The same is true. I represent central Edinburgh, where we have amongst the greatest festivals in the world. Thank you for letting me come through to Glasgow, incidentally. We have great festivals in Glasgow. We have great festivals in Orkney. We have great festivals right across Scotland, and we have to make sure that we are delivering for communities right around the country. And our cultural funding organisation, Creative Scotland, is very mindful of this. We as government are very mindful of that, and that's why where we partner with our national performing companies like the RSNO and Scottish Opera and National Theatre of Scotland and so on, they take their responsibility of performing right around the country very seriously. So are there things that we could and should legislate for at a community level? Yes, and we intend to do that. But I see this very much as part of a suite of approaches that we're trying to make to help the creative and arts sector thrive, to emerge from the difficulty of COVID and constrained funding challenges, to get government policy into a better place that mainstreams culture right across government, and to use the different tools that we need to get ourselves fit to do what we all agree that we're trying to do around a well-being economy.
And staying a little bit with that, and maybe also with one of the principles in the well-being economy, this thing about collaboration and engagement. How do you think that artists and cultural workers can work with governments and policymakers to help achieve these sustainability development goals?
So here I think we have a really shared experience, and this is the advantage of being smaller countries. All of us, some slightly smaller than others, but don't know why I was looking at the Faroese for any particular reason in that context. But the point is, you know, whether we're 5 million or whether we're 50,000 or whatever, we are small enough countries, small enough societies, small enough polities that we bump into each other all the time, and there is no excuse to not meet. And my experience coming into government during COVID was that I spent a lot of time, as we all did, in online meetings, and that culture of meeting and being able to use technology, in addition to now being able to meet face-to-face again, to my mind, I find myself in a lot of meetings. Now, I'm not being critical when I say that. One of the areas that we're trying to make progress on is fair pay and fair work, because there's a significant issue of low incomes and precarious existence, particularly for freelancers in the creative sector. And you know, everybody that matters in that is a part of that process. And I keep on, whenever I'm at sort of wider events, if ever I hear people say, oh, we're not being listened to, or we're not being involved, I say, please put your hand up, because we're very keen to have people involved in terms of policy formulation, in terms of delivery, in terms of best practice. And then the icing of the cake is where we can get together and maybe hear about things that are working elsewhere. The example of the minimum income project in Ireland, I think, is hugely interesting. I'd understand how it as being, you know, the entire basis of the economy changing, and that probably scares some horses, but you can really see how trying it out in the cultural and arts community is an interesting first step. So I'm very, you know, that's just a very current example of best practice or emerging practice that I think we should all look at. And, you know, I finished the answer to this question where I started on, I'm really interested in what are other countries doing. And what are you doing more of, less of, differently, that's making a difference? I mean, we have a particular challenge at the moment, of course, obviously from Brexit, and there's no getting around this. This is a profoundly challenging situation for us because of the end of freedom of movement. So a lot of our younger artists who would naturally have then gone to tour on the European continent, many are not. And, you know, this is a problem. Right, I'll stop. Sorry, I could talk all day about all of this.
No, but it builds on what we talked about this morning about the value and the necessity also of international exchange and international meetings like this, and also what you said, Gun, that, I mean, it's not a solution to say stop traveling. So definitely the international exchange is important. And just before I ask you a question, Lucas, I mean, you're welcome, of course, to also ask each other questions and build on what you say. I mean, you've been together with Arts and Culture whole day today, and how do you see the cultural sector influencing broader discussions about sustainability and well-being?
Yeah, another big question. So I'll try to keep it brief and not to repeat too much what Jerry has already said. So when I read that question, really what came to mind is a quote from Tim Jackson, who was also we mentioned this morning. And I didn't write it down exactly, so I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said something, you know, if we look at the kind of change we have to achieve to become truly sustainable, it's massive. And we need to get there, we need to speak a language that people understand. And, you know, the science can give us a lot of the problem definition. Politics, policies can start think about the solutions, but that's not where most people operate. And so he says, really, it's, at the end, it's through arts and culture that engages the soul of people and how we tell these stories. And I should probably say, those of you who don't know him, he's a professor down in Surrey. He's one of the, I would say, kind of earliest and leading economists on the kind of well-being economy, post-growth field, but he's also a playwright, and so he has done a lot of work in kind of the arts and culture sector as well. And I think in that sense, it's where really the power comes in bringing in our connection to nature as well as especially related to sustainability. I don't think we're going to get to sustainability by just, you know, working out the numbers and, you know, looking the policies and changing the practices. We really need a different story about how we relate to the natural world as well. And that is something that music and arts and culture has done forever. I think, like, I just moved up to the Highlands in Scotland, and really the music there is very much one of the key ways in which people relate to the place and to the landscape and these kind of things. So yeah, I think as an economist, I'm a bit jealous because everybody engages with culture and with music as well. And often in a very conscious way, like people know what music they listen to, they engage with it. I wish people would do that with economics. So in that sense, maybe there's some overlap we can find, I don't know, maybe there's something as an ask, if that's not happening already, whether we can take that question of economics more on through music or arts. I would love to see what that looks like. But that's not my field of expertise, so I will leave it there.
But Gary, I know you have some thoughts about this. Maybe you want to build a little bit on what Lucas said about, I mean, how the cultural sector can contribute to protecting well-being and public health and developing well-being societies.
Sure, so GP, and then I went into public health, so I was a consultant in public health in this city for a number of years, and this city is sort of infamous for having dreadful health, and I was kind of jealous actually when the Norwegians came up and put the microphone so high, because our Nordic neighbours are so tall and so healthy compared to us Glaswegians who are all down with our microphones on the ground with a worm's eye view of the world almost. And we know that the economy is hugely important for health. So we know that more unequal societies are less healthy. We know that where we have destitution and poverty, it's impossible to be healthy. But we also know that where there's a cultural desert, where we don't have a vibrant culture, that's also bad for our health. But I think a healthy economy is one that has a healthy culture, both shaping what that economy is for. So our culture, our shared understanding, our collective understanding of who we are and what we want needs to shape the design of the economy, but the design of the economy is symbiotic. The design of the economy needs to support that flourishing economy. And all of that That mix is what will make a society healthy or not. And just to build on what Mr. Robertson said a while ago about the funding landscape. So we know that in the UK from 2010 we've had huge cuts through the austerity programmes driven largely by the UK government. And that's, I'm not making a party political point here, but that's in the record. And that's caused the Scottish Government block grant to go down, local government grants to go down, and that just erodes all of the cultural institutions that we rely upon. So at local level, that's the theatres and the libraries, it's the education services people can provide, it's the number of teachers we have, but it's also the other aspects that make it possible for people to participate in society. So if you are, living on the street, if you are out of work, if you are going from precarious job to precarious job and having to work all the hours in order to make ends meet, it's really difficult to engage. And so we need to redesign our economy to support cultural flourishing and music, and we need to learn from our neighbours as part of that.
Well, I just wanted to, as kind of feel like my duty as an economist to point out at this stage that austerity was a political choice. Like, we're a rich country. If the UK government wanted to properly fund the culture sector and poverty and invest in renewable energy, they could. The redesign of the economy comes from. So I just wanted to be very clear about that. The Scottish government has less powers in that regard, but just to be very clear about that.
Yeah, and I wanted to just, sometimes we working in the culture field is a little bit jealous about the economist, because it's a language we all understand, and the politicians understand. It's figures, it's numbers, it's like, it's every time we talk about a topic, we end up talking about the economy about it, because that's where we connect and invest. And then it's like we could maybe learn something in the culture field. How could we kind of be more aware, and how to kind of vocally also talk about the value of culture, and how that's, because we all know it and we all say it, but we don't always show it in the economy.
But if I can go back to my theme previously about being conscious of one of the advantages as these northerly nations, is that whether you're an economist or not, or a politician even, in a smaller country, you really have to be living in a bubble to not know somebody who is in the cultural scene. And boy, do I know that. And the cultural scene are very, very, very persuasive about the change that needs to happen on funding, and getting ourselves in a better place, and they're right to do that. And I think we shouldn't be too self-critical. I think the perspective I come to all of this is, if we are not at the front of the queue of thinking about the trajectory towards being a well-being economy and taking a general well-being approach, then who else is? And so there is actually a bit of pressure on us, I feel, because of our history, because of largely speaking, political consensus around relative values, and the fact that culture does play this important part, the fact that we do know we are not separate from our cultural community, it is part of us. It's not just that we know the tunes, we speak the language, we enjoy all of that. But we are, I think, in a symbiotic relationship, and I think we are generally keen to be getting to that place. So if not us, then who else? So we kind of need to get on with it, is my take on all of that.
In one of Lucas's slides, we saw that, several hubs, well-being economy hubs are popping up around the world, and not least in the Nordic region. And what we also circle around it here, that it is important, and it is about priority, and it's necessary, and there are several obvious things that we could do. But what practical steps are needed in order to prioritize cultural development as part of this transition, because there still seem, and one of the posts it also said it, that there still seems to be a gap between this agreement about that it's important, it's high priority, and then the financial priority. Or I don't know, Lucas, maybe it's also about the way economy is, or the relationship between arts and economy. Is it a tool, or is it a goal for making this development? I think my question is to all of you, so just jump in if you want to answer.
Well, this may be slightly tangential, so forgive me and put me back in line immediately. But over the summer in the UK, we had a series of riots. Now, they were largely confined to areas of England, but we weren't immune to that form of rioting in Scotland. There were people signed up to those kind of ideas, and it was sparked by a horrible murder in Southport in northwest England. And what that told me was that the rise of misinformation and disinformation about the causes of those murders and who was behind it, and the narratives that were played out around whose lives were valued and whose lives weren't valued, and there was racism that was very explicit throughout all of that, was something that was indicative of a really narrow form of platform culture, where people were getting their information from particular sources of multinational social media, rather than from conversations and communities amongst people who are friends, who come across one another in different settings, whether that's theatre and arts and music, in our local community centres. And for me, it's the thin end of a wedge of the failure of democracy. And for us to sort of avoid the huge risks that we see playing out in America and elsewhere with the rise of the far right and intolerance and racism, we need to have that cultural conversation that is real, it's person to person, it involves human touch and relationship building, and it's not based on memes that are driven by commercial entities that are pushing particular agendas. And that's part of the economy. The rise of platform social media is an economic choice. It's under-regulated parts of the cultural milieu, and we can do it differently. And so again, we need to have culture, the arts, music, working hand in hand with economic redesign in order to give us democracy, in order to give us hope for a future.
Any comments on that? I know, Gun, you have some thought about yeah.
No, but running a culture house, I feel like I have the possibility to be that space and that place, and it's a huge responsibility. And I think that also as a cultural institution or a festival or a culture worker, to be aware. Facilitation is very important, and also to have the diversity in the programming, in the audience, and to work on that level on a daily basis. It's not only the politicians that we can have great policies, but we also have to do this on a daily basis and to be resilient for the future, and how to have these local communities. Also, the mobility is increasing, and also to meet who are we in our local citizens, who are we in persons. So I think more culture houses, more festivals, more meeting places.
So just to riff off the back of that, I think there is an issue around a kind of democratization of cultural access, which really matters as part of this. And on the one hand, there is part of the dimension of the role that social media and the change that tech is impacting on all of us, and particularly younger generations who have known nothing else but that as part of lives, has a challenge, yes, around radicalization and the examples that were given about societal cleavage and all of that. But I do think there is also an intergenerational thing that's going on that will become ever more apparent, where for part of younger society, culture is not something that they directly take part in at all. It's something that is mediated through tech. And I've not really thought that much about all of that, but you know, we're people who, we're all nodding and going, culture house, fantastic. You know, tell that to a 14-year-old when you're trying to take a PlayStation off them. Good luck. And you know, okay, so that's a slightly frivolous point, but if you want to move from that to then dealing with societal cleavage and underprivilege, how do we make sure that everybody has the opportunity to take part in culture? Now, the good news is there are all kinds of projects that are underway here. I'm sure there are in our Nordic neighbours too. We've got a particularly impactful project which is supported by the Scottish Government, which is through an organisation called Systema, which is about the participation in and playing off classical music. It's not just classical music, but you know, learning instruments and playing as part of an orchestra. And this has been rolled out in some of the most deprived communities in Scotland, and it's absolutely and totally game-changing what it does. So we know that there are interventions. We know there are ways in which we can do all of that. I'm just mindful that you know, I don't want us as people who are kind of signed up supporters of culture and the role that it plays in it are underestimating the scale of the challenge that we have in some parts of society, and then a challenge that I don't think we even begin to understand the changing nature of things because of the role that tech is playing as a mediator, but also as an isolator, because we are seeing phenomena with young people who find it very difficult to interact with others because they prefer to do it, you know, through a screen.
Can I just, yeah, so I think what comes into that as well is also the connection then to the actual physical spaces. I think part of the reason, you know, we could say younger people spend a lot of time on their phone or connect digitally is because there aren't actually a lot fewer spaces for them where they can hang out. Like in our village, I live in a small village in the Highlands, there aren't any spaces for young people to hang out. We have got a community centre that's closed on the weekends and it closes at 8 o'clock at night. All the other spaces are pubs, so if you're not over 18, that's it. They literally have nowhere to go, and then they maybe would play music or sports or, you know, probably do things that would be very good for them. So I just wanted, so that then comes back to, you know, some very kind of economic questions about who owns the spaces and how do we get the money to get them to the place where, you know, where we provide these spaces and these services for young people, I think. So it's, and somebody made that point this morning, might even have been you, that it's, we have to support the people doing it, but we also need the physical infrastructure and we need the organizational infrastructure for culture to work out.
Yeah, and maybe that the thing about those creating art, the artists and the working conditions for artists, and also the acknowledgement about that being an artist is a profession. It's not just something you do, it's actually something you should make a living from. And for more and more artists around, I mean, just the countries represented today, it's almost impossible. And there also, again, there is a kind of a gap, and maybe for me also a paradox between this. Again, we talk about arts as a crucial thing, as a center of strategies for sustainability and for development, and at the same time, being an artist is not valued as a profession. It's not, I mean, in Denmark, there's no structure for, I mean, supporting artists as professionals. I mean, we don't have anything like what you have developed in Ireland about basic income. So how can we get from the situation here and maybe acknowledging the potential that we see in art and in artistic practice, in artistic knowledge, to a place where, I mean, artists are also acknowledged as professionals and actually being paid. We have basic income as one thing, but can we, I mean, do you have any thoughts about that?
So there's not going to be a big bang. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. I don't think anybody acknowledges that that is a realistic prospect. But if we are going to go down a route of, take for example the point I was making before about the mainstreaming of culture in terms of government and its agencies and so on, where, and just to take a very concrete example, somebody, when we were discussing social prescribing and the impact that cultural interventions might make on public services, pointed out one particular case study, and in fact I think it was in Glasgow, which related to the health service. Now, I've often thought about the biggest impact that culture might have on public services would be for the patients of people, the patients in the National Health Service, or the prisoners in our justice system, and so on and so on. But this was giving an example of a cultural impact on the staff of the health service, and then conclusions were made about the difference that that made in terms of mental health and productivity, and a significant decrease in absenteeism, and so on. Now, I'm already beginning to talk the language of government and governance and economists, and coming up with a sort of pound, shilling and pence argument. I'm not making that point. What I am doing, though, is I'm recognizing that the potential that culture has to play an even more significant role in our national life, I think, is beginning to be understood by people who make decisions in a way that it wasn't before. And the next challenge then is, how do you get to change, how does government begin to think about how it budgets in a different way? And this is definitely a one for the economists here, because the way government works is it works on the basis of incrementalism. So you've inherited last year's budget, so what will next year's budget will be? And then somebody comes along and goes, hey, hold on a second, I've got something that's going to radically change the whole way that we think about the health service. And because that's much more of a medium-term challenge, it's very difficult for government to change. So I just put that down as a marker, because if anybody has any ideas about that, because my colleagues in government are all signed up to, and I'm not saying they're slow pedaling on it, but it is a large cultural change. And I think part of the answer to your question, because I think the Irish example is definitely part of the equation potentially, but then the other is, if we can better understand the role that cuts across society, I think that will move things from being seen as a vocational happy extra to being much better supported, much better funded, and properly remunerated.
So just to try and build on it and to talk a wee bit about your question, I guess, about recognising artists and musicians as professionals. And we heard from Angela this morning, and there's a big risk of me mansplaining what Angela talked about this morning in relation to the Irish basic income for artists. But we know that from previous studies, so we looked at the feasibility of introducing a basic income in Scotland. So I chaired the feasibility study group, and ultimately we couldn't introduce a pilot study in Scotland because we couldn't get the devolution arrangement to work because of the welfare systems largely reserved to Westminster, and also the tax system. So it became infeasible and too risky to introduce it because of people coming on and off benefits and whatnot. But we did a lot of evidence reviews of similar kind of studies across the world, and unfortunately the Irish one hadn't started at that point, or we could have added that into the evidence base. But what we found was that when people were given that guaranteed income, whether they were artists or whether they were doing something completely different, people spent a little bit less time in work to do education. So they upskilled themselves. They used the time that they had purposefully to make society better. And we need to trust people a little bit more. We need to use that kind of rights-based approach that everybody has a right to an income, but trust people that they'll use that income to do good things with it, and we'll all flourish as a result, whether that's by artists and musicians and others, adding to our culture and enhancing our democracy and deepening the social fabric, or whether that's people getting skills and setting up new businesses and things. And one of the interesting differences that Angela and I were talking about over lunch, actually, between the Irish pilot and what we were hoping to do in Scotland was that in Ireland, they've sampled a number of people across the entire country. And that allows people to hide a little bit, so there's not too much focus on, you know, a particular village or whatever. But we were hoping to pilot actually in one particular geographical location in Scotland, because we also wondered that if people got that basic income, it would create a different vibe, a different buzz in those places, whereby people would start to say, okay, should we set up a community development trust here? Should we set up a childcare co-op? Should we do other things with the time and the money we now have as a community? Whereas if it's spread quite thinly, you might not see those benefits within a trial. And so in a sense, we need to wait for another trial where it's rolled out in Ireland, hopefully, and then we'll see even bigger benefits, because actually the density of people who have that resource to hand and that extra time and space to think would be manifest in outcomes. So I think there's real hope in those kind of trials, and hopefully the power of a good example, and we often look to the Nordic countries for good examples, because the very fact that you do something different allows that conversation to happen in Scotland, and suddenly the Cabinet Secretary will be asked that, you know, questions in Parliament, did you know about Ireland doing this? Why don't you do it? And that power of the example is really, really important, because it opens up the sociological imagination about what is possible in the future.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, if thinking in terms of if art's the answer, then what should the questions be? I mean, no matter what we're talking about, then maybe we could implement art into all parts of economics and finances. Lucas, you looked as if you wanted to say something.
I just had a thought. I don't know whether it's interesting, but what has really been striking me... Is my microphone working? No. Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, I just had a thought that it does struck me the way we've been talking today. My background is much more in sustainability and sustainable development. But the way we've been talking about arts and culture as something that goes through everything, that needs to be embedded in everything, really strikes me as very in parallel to how we've been doing a lot of talking in the sustainability community, how sustainability is not this one thing there, but it's something that needs to be embedded through everything else. And so it's really, in some ways, we're talking about really some really fundamental kind of foundations here, but I'm starting to ramble now, so I'll leave it there. So that's just what Sina saw kind of going on in my head.
And Gun institution, how do you see that cultural institutions, like for example the Nordic House, can help making this shift towards more sustainable societies? Because, I mean, we have talked about the cultural institutions quite a lot this afternoon, and also the collaborations between artists, institutions and politicians. So the role of cultural institutions in this shift.
We have a very important role, and being part of the Nordic Council of Ministers is always like talking about culture. That's the kind of the core topic that always kind of comes into the Nordic cooperation. But I think sustainability, we can talk about social sustainability and the green change sustainability. And social sustainability, I think for us it's very important also to have a diversity in the program, to have different kind of art forms, but also audiences, and also to have artists representing maybe also different values and different stories than we hear in our own communities. And then going to the green change, I think we have a big responsibility to facilitate and take responsible for our venue, but also what the choices that artists can take when they come. And talking about payment and to get kind of, that's also a responsibility as a facilitator to pay the fee and to be aware of what you ask for and also show it in the budgets. And we can also keep on fighting for the artist rights and to be
So
station.
what would you say is the biggest barrier for you in actually, I mean, using your potential as a cultural house 100%?
I think, like, for the biggest barrier at the moment is to change to the green energy, because we are a political institution. We can't get the loan, so we can't, and I can prove that we can pay it back in 8 years, the investment, but I don't have it in my budget. And then you have the carbon footprint calculation on top of it. So only the payback in 8 years investment. Nothing happens. So now I'm trying to make kind of an agreement with the local government to make it happen. But it's these kind of obstacles that pops up every time you're trying to do some changes or want to develop or maybe to do the green change. It's often the rules or the policies, which is hard to change. But we keep on fighting and saying it out loud.
Well, I was struck the initial response about the impact that a cultural institution can have on a place in relation to sustainability. By a recent visit I had to Dundee. For those of you who are not from Scotland, don't know Dundee. Dundee is a city that has very significant issues of social deprivation, industrial decline, post-industrial city, which has gone through a remarkable transition because of the opening of the V&A design museum, which is it's an absolute jaw-dropping building and is very, very much open to the public and is very, very well supported by the public of Dundee. And I was there on the same day as I was asked to go and speak at the opening of the Dundee Design Festival. And I was struck at both of these events by how profound an impact these cultural venues and events were having on a city and the people in the city around issues of sustainability and also about the role that culture can play. And Dundee is the first UN City of Design in the UK, and the Design Festival takes place in an old, repurposed tire factory in the city, and they have made a virtue of the fact that the event is being organized in a way that is sustainable, that what is in the Design Festival has sustainability at the heart of the approach of the event. And I was just struck by how powerful both the role of the V&A in the city in rethinking itself culturally, and then this event taking place. These two things were having such a profound impact on places, and I'm sure we can come up with a list of names of other cities in Scotland that would, they would want to bite off an arm or a leg to have that transformational opportunity that Dundee has. So I'm the glass half full person in approaching this is to recognize the transformational impact that culture can play, that sustainability is being reflected in the work of our cultural organization. It's happening. We don't need to reinvent this, and that we need to support it. So decision makers or funders and those who inform the debate, we need to realize that we're onto a good thing with this, and we need to support that. And we need to work out ways that, places, because of where they are, or the size of, where do you live in the Highlands? How small, where are you? I'm in Wellbeing space. I think I'm totally convinced of the role that it can play and how powerful it could be and should be.
And maybe, from that, using the last 5 minutes on talking about how Scotland, the Nordics and our neighbours can work together on making this change and using culture as a kind of a driving force in changing our societies into more sustainable societies based on well-being, and also actually, use our position often as places to be seen upon from the rest of the world the best way, because we seem to share many of the same, both the struggles but also visions for culture, but still we haven't really turned it into practice. So how can we work together from here?
So the first thing is we're doing it, you know, hallelujah, here we are, we're doing it. You know, this isn't a top-down thing. So you've had your morning, you've had your discussion, you're influencing people like me, or academic thinking, and cultural practitioners. So the first thing is it's happening, so that's a good thing. What can we do more of, I think, is probably the question that needs to be posed. And again, I would reflect on the fact, so I'm looking at a colleague here who heads the Scottish Government office in Copenhagen. And, you know, I have said to her and to colleagues elsewhere, I really want us to be reaching out, to be involved in culture being a mainstream part of our international networks work. And yes, that's the screen sector. We're very interested in the success of that Denmark's having. But there's much more than that that we can be doing on a government-to-government level, on our cultural organizations working together, and supporting projects that bring us together. And so we're not just talking about things, but we're actually going to enjoy the culture later on today as well. So, you know, the glass is half full. We are meeting, we are talking, we are learning, we are aspiring to do more. We just need to get on with it, is my view.
So I would love all the Nordic countries to join the Wellbeing Economy Governance Group, because I think that has the potential to redefine what success is. So for too long, the OECD and the World Bank have defined the success of countries by their gross domestic product. But of course, if I chuck a chair through that window, that increases GDP, because somebody's going to be paid to come along and refit the window, and the policeman's going to become richer on overtime as I'm processed through the jail system over the coming weeks. That increases GDP, but it doesn't it doesn't increase human well-being. So why not redefine success as part of that Wellbeing Economies group as how vibrant is your culture? How good is the health of the population? How vibrant and deep is your democracy? Think about those as markers of success rather than essentially unhelpful markers like GDP and economic growth.
Gun, last comment from you maybe on this?
Such a good ending, so I don't know. I think it's important to meet on different levels, culture workers, artists, politicians, and sometimes together, to talk and discuss and to kind of get to know each other. But I think also the funding system and the funding bodies should follow, because to meet we have to have some funding. So I think that's also, or a focus, or yeah. So it's also important to look at that structure around these meeting places, and who is invited and who is not invited is also important. I'm very happy to be invited.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, what you said about the funding relates very well to the philosophy of well-being economy, this seeing economy as a tool and not as a goal in itself. So is that kind of a driving thought in our collaboration as well on different levels? I think that some decisions might be changed because it's a different way of thinking. Lucas, would you like to give a last comment before we round off?
I don't really have much to add, and we're just on time, so I think I will leave it there and just say I've really enjoyed the day and I've learned a lot and will take it away and think about it.
And for myself, well, to finish where I started, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to learn from you. Not that long ago, the Scottish Government announced that we're reviewing our national funding body, and how it works, in significant part for me, because we're going to have a significant amount more money to do what we're trying to do. So it's not just about pouring more resource on how we have done things up until now. It is about how can we practically learn from some of these aspirations to do things. So this is an offer back to you, is if you've got good ideas, if you've got priorities that you think need to be taken a lot more seriously or less seriously or done differently, now is a really, really good time. I'm not just saying this to Scotland-based people, but to friends from elsewhere, because that would be the manifestation of what we've been talking about in terms of our cooperation, is where are the good ideas? How can we bring that into a reimagined cultural and arts sector and the important role it plays in society? That's what I'm really keen to see us do in Scotland, and I'm sure colleagues from other Nordic nations in this context would be saying exactly the same to you as well.
Thank you. And thank you to the four of you, and also to all of you staying and listening for this discussion this afternoon. I hope it's the first of more discussions with more people, because I think, as you all said, conversations, that's the first step for collaboration and for action. So thank you very much for this afternoon.
Thank you so much, everybody. And I just want to say, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow bright and early for the next installment of Nordic Music Days Nordics program. Thank you so much.